Last night, Bernie Sanders had a town hall with CNN, and look, he was asked what he can expect to be asked in every appearance like this. How is he going to pay for his programs? In this case, though, he came prepared with receipts.
I am really excited about getting a Democrat in office. And when I hear you speak, I get really excited. But I remember that Trump excited his base with a promise to build a wall with no real plan to pay for it. Your plan for free college tuition and Medicare for all seems like a way to excite the Democratic base, but with no real plan to pay for it. Now, how is your position in your campaign different than what Donald Trump did?
Oh, I think. Chris, I'm going to give this to you. I thought that question might come up. All right, here it is. This is a list which will be on our website tonight of how we pay for every program that we have developed. So I'll tell you exactly how we pay for it. We pay for it through a rather modest tax on Wall Street speculation. That is how we pay for that. All right? You will remember 12 years ago, the Congress, against my vote, bailed out the crooks on Wall Street who nearly destroyed this economy. I think a modest tax on Wall Street speculation right now to make sure all of our kids who have the ability and the desire get the education they need is something that we should do.
So look, that was a bold move. He knew he was going to be asked about it, so he brought papers and then put them back in his thing. That's the noise ring out.
The control room loves
demonstrating
it.
point. Demonstrating a point. But anyway, look. So look, I was interested in seeing that. I saw that Cuomo took a brief glance at it. I went to the website and looked in detail, and let's give you an idea of what you can find if you go to that, and it's all available right now. So on BernieSanders.com, it says, for instance, it will cost $2.2 trillion to make public colleges, universities, and trade schools tuition-free and to cancel all student debt over the next decade. Laudable goals, obviously. It's fully paid for by a modest tax on Wall Street speculation that will raise an estimated $2.4 trillion over 10 years. Now, obviously, for each of these individual components, there is more to it which you can find, and we can have a debate about whether the numbers work out the way he's saying, but it is all there. Hypothetically, that should cut off some of these constant repetitive questions about how you pay for it when it is available for you if you want to know.
Yeah, and also when you look at that figure for 2.2 trillion, you would assume, I'm forgetting the exact number of how much money is indebted to students, but that's a good amount of it. The $1 trillion figure, it would be cut into because the annual cost of paying for public colleges and universities tuition free actually is not that much.
Yeah, much of it's the debt.
Much of it's the debt. So that would just be the initial cost, but the way that the program would be sustained over time is actually quite cheap and could be paid for quite very easily by that very speculative tax that he's talking about. But it's amazing how he talks about taxing Wall Street and their trading in this nonchalant way when that just gives donors and wealthy folks a heart attack because that's how they make a lot of their money. But that's because of deregulation over time. It wasn't always that way. And it's caused a lot of problems, to say the least.
Yeah, and by the way, so like he's talking about, here's what it costs, here's what we're gonna raise, a direct one-to-one that you can see. But hypothetically, we could engage in the sort of talk around these things that you hear, for instance, when Republicans talk about cutting taxes. So they say, we're gonna cut taxes on the wealthiest people, and then they're gonna plow that money back into the economy. And so I know it seems like the government would make less money in tax revenue, but somehow it'll actually be more. That's obviously not how it works. These people already have more money than God. When they get more money, they don't suddenly spend it all. That's not how it works at all. Much of it ends up outside of the country. But for a regular person who hypothetically could either write a check for $600 a month to Sally Mae, or could go out and spend it on hamburgers and cars and TV and clothes and all that stuff. That is a very easy to understand constant stimulus on the economy. And that's not factored into this. This hypothetically could help to pay for it. And that's not even considered a part of this.
Well, that's absolutely accurate. And the fact of the matter is that the reason home ownership is down, the reason young people don't invest in the stock market at the rate at all of the older generations, also because of the fact that we lived through the financial collapse and know what devastation that can be. But part of that is because they have so much money tied up in student debt. And yeah, so the banks getting their interest payments from students who just want to get an education, or basically the students getting their money back and they're able to pump that money back into the economy because wealthy people save their money, they hoard it. People who are middle class, poor people put their money back into the economy and it creates a more robust spending system and a better economy for all of us.
Yeah.
But when you're actually just representing the interests of the powerful and couching it in pretending to care about the economy, that's what you get with Republican talking points, and even CNN's framing a lot of the time when they're talking about this very issue.
And a version of sort of what I was laying out there, some of the other ways that it's not literally in the calculations, but that it will be affected. That stuff is included in some of the more complex, more expensive proposals. So as an example, let's jump ahead to the Green New Deal graphic. They have that $16.3 trillion proposal, and then they break it down into a number of different components, including fossil fuel industry being forced to pay for their pollution. You have the wholesale of energy for a number of years before electricity in the US eventually transitions over to effectively being free. It's renewable, obviously. Reduce military spending by scaling back military operations on protecting the global oil supply, a cost that is rarely talked about in forums like this. You have extra income tax revenue from jobs that have been created, as well as less social safety net spending that will have to be given out because people will have the jobs from this proposal. So some of these are more complex, but it is all there, and there's more information besides if you're interested in that.
Just an aside really on this. It's truly incredible that basically one congresswoman and a grassroots organizing group have forced the Green New Deal to be on the national conversation, as the litmus test for progressive climate change policy. Just a remarkable achievement that only took around 2 years. Really incredible.
It is. And we can't go through too much of what happened at the town hall, but we did want to show you one video of, he was asked about whether he's a radical, whether his proposals are radical, and he had a great response.
Slick giving me this piece of paper.
I know.
I couldn't pay attention. The criticism is there is a lot of detail in here. You can look for it for yourselves on the website. It is not matching the price tag that some put at about $30 trillion for the Medicare for All, but you get about halfway there. No. The question becomes, how do you get the rest of the way?
Well, we get there. There was a study, Chris, I don't know if you happen to see it. I don't know if anyone...
30 trillion over 10 years.
1 minute. A study came out from Yale University, a number of epidemiologists, a really quite good study. What they said is when you get rid of all of the administrative waste that we have now, having to administer, can you believe that thousands and thousands of separate plans? When you get rid of all of that administrative waste, which other countries do, when you get rid of the profiteering of the drug companies, we can, in fact, pay for Medicare for all and substantially lower the cost for the average American worker. Now, you want to know how we're going to pay for it? Well, we can go on for several hours very briefly. Number one, for the average person, how do we pay for it today, Chris? You know how we pay for it? The average family in America makes about $60,000 a year. That family is paying premiums, deductibles, out-of-pocket expenses, and co-payments. That $60,000 a year family is now paying $12,000 a year for healthcare. It's an outrageous sum of money, about 20% of the family's income. What we do, among other proposals in there, is to say, all right, you are that average $60,000 a year family. You're going to pay a 4% tax, exempting the first $29,000, leaving $31,000 of taxable dollars, which is about $1,200 a year. A heck of a lot better than what you're paying today. We also have a payroll tax. We have a payroll tax on employers, which will save them substantial sums of money. And because we're taking on the greed of the pharmaceutical industry, nobody in America on the Medicare for All pays more than $200 a year for prescription drugs.
Okay, so that's my mistake, but it was a happy mistake because that video was great too, because he very clearly and succinctly broke it down, not just in terms of the absolute numbers that you need to know for paying for the whole program, but how it would affect an average family under this new program.
He pretty much did exactly what Chris Cuomo was asking him and what the media has been asking him to do this entire time. Will it affect any of the talking points that come out about how Bernie can't pay for anything? I want your prediction on this, John.
No. The funny thing is, like, I remember there was a moment like this at the last debate, and he broke down how we could pay for it. I think he referenced the Lancet study about how much money would be saved and how many lives would be saved every year if we switched over to a single-payer healthcare system. And the camera went to Buttigieg's face, and Buttigieg looked like he was in pain. It was inconvenient that all of these doctors had come together and pointed out that we could have it all effectively in terms of paying for it and saving lives. That should be a thing that we all then rejoice about. Okay, we can do it, let's get to that. But that wasn't the reaction from a Pete Buttigieg. Pete Buttigieg was like, oh God, I don't want to have to acknowledge that. Can I just go back to my Medicare for whoever, ends up with it plan or whatever?
Yeah, well, he could have just debated himself on cable news around 9-10 months ago, praising Medicare for all as the compromised position. And yeah, Buttigieg has no core principles. We know this very well.
Exactly. Okay, very briefly, the video that I alluded to before, I made a mistake, but let's go to that, about whether his proposals are too radical.
Could you please share how you will allay the fears of those who see your political ideology as too extreme? How do you respond to Americans who believe we need to beat Trump more than we need extreme political policies?
I know if you look at the media, they say Bernie's ideas are radical and they're extreme, they're out of the mainstream. Let me just tell you, I don't think that that's true. Is raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour a radical idea? No. Is making sure that all of our kids have the opportunity to get a higher education, regardless of their income, because we're going to make public colleges and universities tuition free, is that a radical idea? No. This is a scientific poll. You hearing this? Is guaranteeing health care to all people as a human right a radical idea? Is addressing the existential threat of climate change a radical idea? All right, I rest my case.
See, that was pretty good. Let's see that at a debate, perhaps.
I love the call and response. He's done that before. He did that at that Fox News town hall when he just started running for president, and he asked, well, it was a sort of version of it. I guess it wasn't call and response, so just scrap everything I just said. But when he had it might have been, never mind, not important. He had the Fox News audience raise their hand about if they would be in favor of a Medicare for all type system, and it was quite overwhelming. So when he interacts with the audience, it does well. He does well. It's a good tactic that he has when he really has one mode. I mean, when you go to his rallies, like it's the same speech every time. And so I like when he switches it up and gets to be a little looser in this kind of format.
Yeah, it's always funny when they the people on stage get surprised by the audience. It doesn't always even take Bernie. There was a live Fox and Friends where they had a crowd and they asked about, I don't know if it was about medical debt or something, and the idea was supposed to be that the crowd was like, no, everything's great. And like all these hands went up and the hosts were like, oh geez.
I know, Brian Kilmeade's face melts even. Ken Klippenstein, our fallen hero and dear friend, has done some great reporting over at The Nation, his new gig, where he basically got a hold of an internal Bloomberg campaign memo, which detailed how Bloomberg is planning to go after Elizabeth Warren and also explain away the fact that he raised money for and endorsed her Republican opponent for Senate in 2012. Here is the memo that was leaked to Kenny Clips. And as you guys can see there, it's a little bit hard to read, but Bloomberg supported Scott Brown in Massachusetts. They're trying to say because of his willingness to buck the NRA, when really he just, as a Republican, opposed one very basic provision that the NRA wanted to get passed. He was in favor of the assault weapons ban, but was quite favorable to the NRA most of the time. Now, he has also donated a lot of money to Republican politicians in the past. Former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, an outspoken advocate for gun control, this was an article from 2014, recently gave $250,000 to help re-elect a Mississippi Republican with an A+ rating from the NRA. According to the latest campaign finance filings, Bloomberg gave $250,000 to Mississippi Conservatives PAC, a group aiming to re-elect veteran Mississippi Senator Thad Cochran, who is in the fight of his political life against his primary rival, Chris McDaniel. So Bloomberg is now using the excuse for donating to and supporting Scott Brown because, oh yeah, he took on the NRA one time. Yet he had no problem donating to and raising money for Thad Cochran, again, a Republican with an A+ rating from the NRA. So this just does not pass the smell test.
I think you have to understand his, basically, so you had Scott Brown and you had Elizabeth Warren. And in terms of their approach to the NRA and gun control, Scott Brown was against one minor provision that the NRA disagreed with him on. And Elizabeth Warren presumably is a dozen guns stacked up in a trench coat.
Oh, absolutely.
I don't know, like what are you talking about? You can try to make the case that and I'm saying him, not you, that it was because of that thing with the NRA. I have a simpler explanation. He supported the Republican because he was a Republican and he tried to get as many Republicans elected around the country as possible, up to and including endorsing George W. Bush for president and saying afterward he wished Mitt Romney had beaten Barack Obama. That's what Republicans do, and he did it.
Well, let me just give you a few more details about Scott Brown and his endorsement of Scott Brown back in 2012. Again, Elizabeth Warren was successful. She ended up defeating him. And Elizabeth Warren, like you were saying, John, I don't know if the audience is aware, but maybe she could have been some sort of gun nut. She loves AK-47s, goes to the gun range in her off time, wears a bullet around her neck, she's all strapped all the time. Let's go to a Politico article from 2012, which explains Bloomberg's reasoning. Mayor Michael Bloomberg this morning defended his endorsement of Senator Scott Brown, citing Brown's opposition to one particularly controversial piece of NRA-backed legislation, though Bloomberg also noted that Brown is not good on guns generally. Bloomberg will host a fundraiser in August, again, this is in 2012, for Brown in New York City. Brown, a Republican who opposes a national ban on assault weapons, is defending his Massachusetts seat against liberal darling Elizabeth Warren, who supports the ban. So, if you really cared about gun control, you might support the person who is in favor of the assault weapons ban, but the real story is that you like gun control because it's convenient if that candidate is also in favor of the Republican conservative policies that you privilege over that. Wall Street tax cuts for the rich, that's what Elizabeth Warren was against. So he was gonna oppose her no matter what, because that's really not his top priority, even though that's what he's trying to position himself as in this Democratic primary.
For those of us that are confused about exactly where Michael Bloomberg stands on guns is it's okay because so is he's confused on it as well. He doesn't know exactly where he is because he doesn't care about where he is. So the principal thing is the principal argument about where you stand and where your principles lie is null and void in this point. If you flip back and forth so many times, there's no more tracking where you stand on this. But there is one constant. It's supporting people that will support Republicans that will also help support in you hoarding more money and not paying your fair share or even contributing to society the same way the rest of us do. So that's the constant. If you look for what's really happening there, you'll see that. Now I think they mentioned we're gonna see potentially some of the candidates come after Bernie Sanders tonight on previous gun stances, and he's had those questions come at him before. I'm just curious whether or not we're gonna see the level of questions come this guy's way as far as his back and forth and his support for certain candidates versus his opposition to others because of where they landed on the gun issue, where they didn't land on the gun issue, but maybe it's about which political party they were associated with and which one was gonna be most beneficial to him. And we'll get to some of those audio clips of the way he thought and the way he approaches politics and giving the candidates and what he expects of them later.
Yeah. I hope that we see some repetition of the attacks against him from the first debate. So you bring up the sexual harassment suits, you bring up stop and frisk, obviously. Those are huge issues that should be the things people think about when they think about Mike Bloomberg. But in addition, I would add, he has for decades tried to make sure that Republicans rule over as many Americans as possible. And like in a very real sense, Donald Trump becoming president didn't have to be as bad as it was if he didn't have the majority in the Senate, if he didn't get the majority in the Supreme Court. Those are all things, tools, weapons that were given to Donald Trump by a lot of people, but few individually contributed more than Mike Bloomberg did. And in an electorate that supposedly is worried about Bernie Sanders not being a Democrat, wait until they find out when one of the candidates, not Bernie Sanders, has tried to get Republicans elected and has spent countless millions of his own dollars to do it.
And just the argument about how his money would make him the best candidate to defeat Trump. That's the only really thing he has to stand on at this point, because everyone knows how uncharismatic and terrible he is. Hillary Clinton had more money than Donald Trump in 2016, and I wonder how that turned out. In the general election, media is the money there. Like, there's so much free media that how much money you have doesn't really matter when you're the candidate that's representing the two parties. It's really, you get so much free media that it's not gonna matter. And it's so clear that Bloomberg would lose to Trump, as well as the fact that he is so unprincipled, even on his pet issue, gun control. He was way more in favor of keeping his tax cuts in place than actually supporting someone who would do something on gun control, Elizabeth Warren. In fact, he backed her opponent vociferously and tried to make sure that she wasn't going to be in the Senate. Too bad for him.
So if you think about it, his vow is to make sure we find someone that can defeat Trump. If he happens to not defeat Trump, if he happens to even get the nomination, that's okay, doesn't really matter. Because again, the policies line up. This is what you have to look at. There's no devastation if he loses to Trump from his point of view. He's like, well.
The big controversy around Bernie Sanders this week that's supposed to tank his presidential bid is that he said something positive about Fidel Castro and about Cuba. Here is his response to that brewing controversy.
Singing the praises of a murderous tyrant. Response.
The response was when Fidel Castro first came to power, which was when, 59? Does that sound right?
59-60.
Okay, you know what he did? He initiated a major literacy program. There was a lot of folks in Cuba at that point who were illiterate. And he formed the Literacy Brigade. You may read that. He went out and they helped people learn to read and write. You know what? I think teaching people to read and write is a good thing. I have been extremely consistent and critical of all authoritarian regimes all over the world, including Cuba, including Nicaragua, including Saudi Arabia, including China, including Russia. I happen to believe in democracy, not authoritarianism.
To the Democrats who say, you don't say good things about Fidel Castro. He destroyed freedoms in that country. He picked winners and losers and killed them and put them in prison forever. You don't give him a pat on the back for anything.
You don't give, it's not a question. Truth is truth.
I believe that I've literally said that on the Damage Report over and over again. First of all, it's not singing praise. It's not patting on the back. It's acknowledging an objective fact. It's not saying he helped improve literacy among the poor and thus we should be Cuba, obviously. And I think everybody understands that. Some people this week who have not been doing very well in some of these early contests and don't look like they're gonna have a great Super Tuesday are pretending that they don't understand that and pretending that what Bernie Sanders was doing was attempting to convince you that you should support him, but really what you should support is Castroism.
Factually, he's absolutely correct. Is it a good political move to double down on this? I think that's an open question. We've lost Florida on this alone.
But he's not doubling down. He said, yes, I'm not going to pretend that literacy went down under him, but he denounced it as a brutal regime multiple times.
Yes.
Which is what all the critics are saying they want him to do.
No,
and yet they seem non-placated when he does so.
I agree. Factually, on the question he is, and the answer that he's giving, he's absolutely right, per usual. Yes, there are some nuances when we're looking at the Castro regime in Cuba, but there are also some really devastating aspects. And it's such a raw issue for Cubans, specifically in the state of Florida, that if you're making political calculations and looking towards the general election, perhaps it's not the best move to double down on this. And we've seen that Bernie Sanders is not above making political calculations. He distanced himself from the Zephyr Teachout op-ed that called Joe Biden corrupt, because Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders have a lot of crossover voters inexplicably. He did the same thing with Nina Turner's comments in the past about other candidates. So he will back away from things when he sees that there's a political risk. I think there's political risk here, and I don't know if doubling down's the right move, but again, he's right. So I get it.
It fundamentally bothers me that we are a culture that cannot dwell in nuance we can't dip our toe in nuance. Everything has to be black and white.
But that is the culture, right?
But how do we change that? By capitulating to the black and whiters?
But he barely capitulates. He operates in nuance and he operates in intellect about the left and has changed the conversation nationally on so many issues. You don't need to die on a hill, specifically when it's going to hurt you and the Democratic Party in the state of Florida and in other areas where there are a lot of Cuban Americans come the general election.
Okay, well, look, it's possible later tonight he will face, this will be brought up 100%, probably is the first question from the moderator. It's not even like you have to wait for one of his opponents to bring it up. They will tee it up for Pete Buttigieg to hit at him. And why do I choose Pete Buttigieg? Well, because he's already doing so. Here's an example.
So this is part of what I'm getting at when I say that in our one shot to defeat Donald Trump, we should think carefully about the consequences of nominating Senator Sanders. I don't want, as a Democrat, I don't want to be explaining why our nominee is encouraging people to look on the bright side of the Castro regime when we're going into the election of our lives. We need to stand unequivocally against dictatorships everywhere in the world.
And so you don't think that's a good excuse. He says he thinks he's a dictator, but literacy is a good thing. There's no nuance to that.
Why are we of course, literacy is a good thing, but why are we spotlighting the literacy programs of a brutal dictator instead of being unambiguous in our condemnation about the way he's treated his own people?
Yeah, so what Don Lemon was doing there was entirely reasonable. He was saying, you say you want him to say that he's a brutal dictator. Oh, by the way, he's already done that. Does that placate you? And Buttigieg says, no, I need this. I need this so bad. It's still not acceptable.
Well, he was never going
like
to be
he cares,
happy with
like
the
he's
answer.
thought for a moment about Castro in his life before today.
Yeah, I mean, he's like Marco Rubio's brother from another mother in some ways. Like you know, don't you remember
the political performances you're saying?
Political performance. It reminds me, and then like they both get hung up on that issue as well. But he was never going to be happy with any of the answers that Bernie Sanders provided. It's just a political football for him, and he's using it to kick him because he sees him as the specific target that's going to lead him to some long shot chance at the nomination when he has zero path. Because I know it's really hard for him to accept, but there are black and brown voters in other states, and you do really badly with all of them. And perhaps you should maybe think about why, as opposed to just going on the offensive about Bernie Sanders' specific comments and the nuances with which he condemned Fidel Castro and the Castro regime. It's just political theater.
And look, I know that we haven't hit Super Tuesday yet. I just want to briefly say to those who've been crowing about unity for the past year, the main message was, Bernie, you're gonna lose to Biden. So that means don't criticize Biden. Don't put anything out there that's gonna hurt him when you're long gone and Biden's going up against Donald Trump in the general election. Doesn't matter if it's true, don't say it because it'll hurt him. And yet you have Pete Buttigieg saying, we're gonna lose Florida, we're gonna lose Florida. Why? Here's why. I'm gonna repeat it over and over and over again, even though I have zero chance of getting the plurality, let alone a majority of the delegates. It looks almost certainly like Bernie Sanders is gonna be that person, but I will torpedo him and the party's chances if it seems to help me briefly. But I'm not even as mad at Pete Buttigieg as, I apologize I don't have the name here, but a DNC spokesperson went on Fox News today to talk about this and to attack him. In particular, to put it out there for Fox News to amplify those in the DNC who have been saying that unity is the goal. We have to have unity. How could you possibly hurt our chances? They're doing everything they can to hurt Bernie Sanders. And because, like it or not, from their point of view, Bernie Sanders is likely to be the nominee, they are hurting him in his quest to beat Donald Trump.
Yeah, I was about to bring up that despicable segment on Fox News, which I thought liberals were supposed to completely avoid. The DNC official is going on there and making critical comments about Bernie Sanders just really for no reason. I thought we were supposed to stand behind the party candidate. I guess you stand behind the party candidate when they're the one keeping the lights on at the DNC because you guys got so deeply in debt after you paid all of those consultants and Hillary Clinton had to bail you out, literally paying your bills as you were supposed to preside over a neutral primary between the two of them. So obviously that's what you need to do to get fair treatment by the DNC, or just be anyone other than Bernie Sanders. That's option.
It's a good start.
Option B, yeah.
Exactly, don't be Bernie. Always be not being Bernie, that's the rule. I don't know the acronym for that.
Don't miss your chance to win.
There is a big debate brewing across the country on bias in the Supreme Court. Some in the Supreme Court believe that some of the justices are biased towards the Trump administration. Trump believes the opposite, effectively. Let's talk about where this started from. So on Friday evening, by a 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court allowed the Trump administration's wealth test for immigrants to take effect in Illinois. All 4 liberal justices dissented from the order, which changes relatively little thanks to the conservative justices' intervention in January. The wealth test was poised to take effect in 49 states. Friday's vote lets the government apply it in the last state left. And there was a dissenting opinion written by Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who effectively made the case that when lower courts rule against the Trump administration goes running immediately to the Supreme Court and says, this is an emergency, you need to save us, and overturn that lower court ruling. No multi-year process of working its way up through the courts. It's, you need to take this up right now and you need to help us immediately. And she's noticed a pattern in the way this plays out. Here's a bit of her dissenting opinion. Claiming one emergency after another, the government has recently sought stays in an unprecedented number of cases, demanding immediate attention and consuming limited court resources in each. And with each successive application of courts, its cries of urgency ring increasingly hollow. She added, perhaps most troublingly, the court's recent behavior on stay applications has benefited one litigant over all others, a reference obviously to Donald Trump and his administration. And that's really the problem. They have 5 justices now. If a lower court rules against them, he has a get out of, balance of powers free that he can go to anytime he wants right now.
Yeah, so basically the Trump administration is using the Supreme Court, not in the way it's intended, but as a funnel to rubber stamp its very controversial policies and often racist and discriminatory policies. And that's not how the court system is supposed to be used. So Sonia Sotomayor here is pointing out that she's troubled by the way that the Trump administration is funneling basically their policies through, because they know that they have these 5 conservative justices who are just going to okay whatever the Trump administration wants to do. But that's really what the legislative arm of the government is supposed to be participating in. It's theoretically supposed to be a body that's encouraged to be compromising. In this era of partisan politics where everyone's bought off, that's not the reality. But just because that's not the reality doesn't mean you get to use the court system in the way that the legislature is supposed to be used in that sense.
So this isn't even anything where Justice Sotomayor is pulling this out of nowhere. Trump has said this. He said it over and over again. He's like, well, we have the Supreme Court. As long as we have the Supreme Court, everything will be okay. If this goes to the Supreme Court, it'll be okay. Everything that it has any kind of pushback from other under court systems, he makes sure he says, we can send it to the Supreme Court and it'll be okay. He and Mitch McConnell have talked about how the biggest legacy they have is switching over the courts in this country, because that's a legacy that lasts forever. You can be in office for 8 years, but then if you put someone in a permanent position in a court, on the Supreme Court especially, it'll live on forever. We saw how it happened at the end of Obama's administration to the beginning of Trump's. Now they want to keep packing the courts. Now they'll do exactly what they say everyone else is trying to do. These libs trying to pack the courts and flip things and make sure everyone actually has rights and freedoms in this country. What we want to do is push a conservative lean to all these courts, and it's exactly what they're doing. There was a graphic that they put forward about the number of judges that Trump has appointed in his 3 years now versus the 8 years under Obama. And guess who was chuckling like a demon about it was Mitch McConnell. He's like, that's not by mistake. He was laughing just like that. So when
it's eerie.
So you can have pushback on what Justice Sotomayor said, but you have to have pushback on what you've already said in the past, because it's exactly the same.
Yeah. For right now, I mean, I'm glad that she was able, or I guess I should say, willing to be so honest. You have her writing these dissenting opinions as part of the 4 liberal minority on the court. And if Trump gets reelected, we can look forward to her continuing to do that as part of the 3 liberal, or 2 liberal, or maybe by the end of 8 years, 1 liberal minority on the Supreme Court. Those will be exciting times. And what sort of justices will he be replacing the current ones with? Well, we know what he wants, and what he wants is loyalty. He certainly hates disloyalty. Here he is talking about the bias he believes exists on the Supreme Court.
What is the basis for your opinion on that?
Well, it's very obvious. I mean, I always thought that, frankly, that Justice Ginsburg should do it, because she went wild during the campaign when I was running. I don't know who she was for. Perhaps she was for Hillary Clinton, you can believe it. But she said some things that were obviously very inappropriate. She later sort of apologized. I wouldn't say it was an apology, but she sort of apologized. And then Justice Sotomayor said what she said yesterday. You know very well what she said yesterday. It was a big story. And I just don't know how they can not recuse themselves for anything having to do with Trump or Trump related. The right thing to do is that. Now, as a Supreme Court justice is a different standard, but at the same time, I think it's a higher standard in a certain sense. So they'll have to decide what to do. But her statement was so inappropriate. When you're a justice of the Supreme Court, and it's almost what she's trying to do is take the people that do feel a different way and get them to vote the way that she would like them to vote. I just thought it was so inappropriate. Such a terrible statement for a Supreme Court justice.
So there he is talking about his belief, his wish, his fantasy that the two of the liberals on the court should recuse themselves from any case involving him. And because it's Donald Trump, historically, that means it's gonna be a lot of cases. So he's got the majority in the court, and 2 of the 4 liberals should just butt out of every single one of those cases that he and the DOJ and the Trump administration in general gets the Supreme Supreme Court to pluck out from the lower courts and immediately take up to make his agenda happen.
Why does he even care? The 5 conservative justices are just gonna vote with him anyway. And so it's just really all ego, because he sees these 2 very outspoken Supreme Court justices talking about what they see as an undemocratic, unconstitutional way of going about things in terms of the judicial system, and they are of course correct here. And I love how he's lecturing people on inappropriate statements. And another piece of hypocrisy, and how it's just all projection with a lot of conservatives these days, is he expects loyalty, as John said, from these Supreme Court justices, even though they don't serve him. But he's one of the most disloyal people in American history to the people that he works with. So it's just another irony on top of the many ironies that that Trump personifies.
I dare one of these conservative justices to actually rule on a large enough case against Trump and see what he has to say about them then. This whole loyalty thing and how great it is that he appointed these people on the courts. If any of them has any kind of wavering support of him, it'll turn into, we'll see more revelations about what he really thinks of people. So if we're talking about recusing themselves, you mentioned how I may not know the word recuse. He only learned it because of Jeff Sessions.
Yeah, that's true.
He was upset about the fact that he did do it. But I was reading an article earlier this day, and I didn't think it would be relevant, so I skimmed it. But Ginny Thomas, the wife of Justice Thomas on the Supreme Court, that same Supreme Court that Trump wants the loyalty for and wants 2 justices to recuse themselves from, she works on making sure that the White House has rid themselves of all of these snakes and backbiters and disloyal people after the impeachment process. So she's mad about that, and she's whispering in the ear of White House aides about personnel at the White House, as well as ridding them of other folks that aren't loyal enough. That's not a connection to the Supreme Court. The wife, a political conservative activist in our country, is connected to a Supreme Court justice who always rules in favor of conservatives, and particularly this president. And 2 of the people that she was suggesting be on staff is Dan Bongino and Sheriff Clark. So these are so Justice Thomas shouldn't be recusing himself on everything related to Trump, because your wife is directly related in meeting with Trump officials about personnel in the White House and also ridding other people so that things can stay loyal within his lawlessness.
That's a great point, but you are discounting the fact that Clarence Thomas is one of the 10 worst people in the country.
And also, Trump specifically said that he didn't like what Ginsburg said. And so we don't have to worry about that with Thomas, since he's never spoken in public, actually.
Because he's loyal.
Exactly.
It's weird. If you only have to be principled, which by the way is not even a principled stance if they recuse themselves. You only be principled if it's something that's associated with being against Trump. So if you're against me, then you're principled to step aside. But again, when Jeff Sessions was trying to be principled and recused himself, that's disloyalty. It has nothing to do with principles at all.
That's how low the bar is for being